We're often asked by clients how to complete safety method statements and risk assessments. In this particular example, we're going to look at a safety method statement and associated risk assessments related to installation of partition walls. The format of your risk assessment and safety method statement will vary, but there are some key elements which we'll look at. Initially, we would want to see the project name and details of the task involved. Ideally, we'd also want some kind of supervisor details for the site manager, contracts manager involved in the works. You may also have a safety officer that you want to include within your safety method statements. We would also look at key areas such as plant and equipment. In this particular example, we've identified mobile scaffold towers, 110 volt drills, hand tools, paddle mixers, screw guns and fixing guns. When putting together your method statement, you also need to check that any equipment has been maintained and is in good working order, including any pat tests that are required. You also need to consider key materials, in this particular instance things like metal stud and plasterboard, and how you are going to transport these equipment to site. Essential equipment such as mobile scaffold towers should be on there, and you may want to include additional information such as hop-ups and steps. Within the risk assessment section at the back of the method statement, we would identify particular specific residual hazards such as work at height or manual handling. It's also important to understand any specific training your employees may need to undertake this task on site. For example, mobile scaffold towers would require PASMA certification, work at height and manual handling for this particular task. Possibly the most key element of undertaking a safety method statement is to describe the operation. When you undertake this, it's also important to have assessed the requirements of the work environment, but also to understand if your operatives have any particular issues with the work on site. So you would need to, for example, identify things like, have you seen an asbestos R&D survey if you're working above ceilings, how you are going to transport material to site, whether that be on rubber wheel bogies, whether there's any lifts on site. Everything you need to actually get your work, equipment and operatives on site needs to be assessed. You also need to think about things like what PPE you may have on site, and if you need any specific permits to work that may need to be in place. In this particular example, we've identified that there may be some M&E cables above the ceiling areas, and then may need to be looked at under a permit to work with an ME contractor involved in doing any remedial works prior to you setting foot on site. The key element is to identify your work operations. How is the work going to be undertaken on site in a practical manner, so that your operatives can understand how it should be undertaken and make sure there are no key elements missing. This all needs to be detailed within your safety method statement so that operatives understand before they start to work, and this should be ideally done in a bullet point type format. In this particular example, we've also included an asbestos procedure, both in terms of a refurbishment and demolition survey prior to works being undertaken on site, but also looking at potential area of asbestos, also looking at an asbestos procedure should the unexpected happen and you discover asbestos. What needs to be undertaken on site and how is that done? And also things like potentially accidental release of asbestos on site and an emergency procedure. All your operatives need to be aware of this particular scenario and be trained to what to do should this happen on site. You may want to look at things like as well access equipment on site. We've also mentioned things like ladders and step ladders, and potentially any hazardous substances and what cost assessments you may need for things like plasterboard, insulation, etc. that you may use on site. All these should form part of your safety method statement and be communicated to your operatives on site. For large works, you may need to have storage areas on site, and in this particular example, you may need to have some kind of coordination with the principal contractor on site to understand where your materials are going to be stored, and if you need any particular arrangements should you have flammable materials that need to be stored. It's also important to understand and document what PPE you're going to be used on site, and in some instances you may need to specify types of PPE such as respiratory equipment, hearing protection, etc. Key elements such as emergency procedures should also be covered, and if you're working on a principal contractor site, your emergency procedures should follow in line with the principal contractor's requirements. You'll also need to ensure that welfare facilities are available on site, and again, you may want to coordinate these with the principal contractor on site. There may well be other things that you want to include in your safety method statement, such as services on site and any other information or attachments that you think are irrelevant that may want to be included within the document. It's also important that all your safety method statement has a sign-off sheet, and all your operatives on site sign and date the method statements to say that they've fully read and understood how work is to be undertaken on site. In this particular example, we've also included a risk assessment at the back of the safety method statement. Risk assessments again can vary in terms of format. In this particular one, we have the likelihood against the consequence, which gives us a risk rating of low, medium or high. We provided a particular example in our risk assessment format. This particular example relates to one hazard, which we look at dust on site. We've identified the hazard. We also identify the potential risks involved, and we undertake a risk rating based on limited control measures being undertaken on site. In this particular example, we have a likelihood of 4 and a severity of 5, which gives us a risk rating of 20, which in reality gives us a high risk rating. The idea of the risk assessment is to reduce that down as far as is reasonable practical. We then carry out a residual risk, which is on the right hand side, and again we look at the likelihood and severity times the two together, which now gives us a risk rating of 6, which is a low risk rating, which ideally we're looking to reduce down as far as reasonably practicable. Hopefully this gives you an overview of how to complete a method statement and safety risk assessment.